I watched the clock hit 14:47 CET when Viktor Orbán placed a single black folder on the podium. The European Parliament chamber in Brussels fell into a silence so absolute I could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Ursula von der Leyen sat 3 rows back, her face unreadable, her hands folded with the kind of precision that suggested she knew exactly what was coming. This wasn't a routine parliamentary session. This was an execution. The Hungarian Prime Minister didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When you're about to detonate a financial bomb worth $847 billion in outstanding debt obligations, theatrics are unnecessary. He opened the folder with deliberate slowness, and I saw something I hadn't witnessed in 15 years covering European politics. Genuine fear rippling through the faces of commissioners who'd spent their careers insulated from accountability. The numbers he was about to read weren't projections, they were autopsy results for a union already dying. I've sat through hundreds of these sessions. The usual rhythm is predictable. Scripted questions, diplomatic non-answers, polite applause. But the moment Orbán's fingers touched that folder, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. MEPs who'd been checking phones suddenly looked up. Translators leaned closer to their microphones. Even the stenographers seemed to sense they were about to record something historians would cite for decades. The European project, that grand post-war experiment in continental unity, was about to have its financial foundations exposed as sand. "Madame Présidente," Orbán began, his eyes locked on von der Leyen, "can you explain to this chamber why the European Commission has concealed the true scale of our debt exposure?" The question landed like a grenade. Von der Leyen's chief of staff leaned in, whispering urgently, but she waved him off. She knew the cameras were recording everything, every micro-expression, every hesitation. This was the moment the Brussels bureaucracy had been dreading since the first COVID recovery bonds were issued in 2020. What Orbán revealed next wasn't speculation. It was a classified internal audit from the European Court of Auditors, leaked just 72 hours earlier. The document showed that EU member states are collectively liable for $847 billion in joint debt instruments, with repayment schedules extending to 2058. But here's the part that made my hands go cold as I scribbled notes. $3.12 billion of that total has no designated revenue stream, no tax base, no enforcement mechanism. It's phantom collateral backed by nothing but the political willpower of nations already fracturing under populist pressure. I've covered financial scandals before. The Greek crisis, the Italian bond collapse, but this is different. This is systemic. Orbán cited a specific clause, Article 122 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which was used to justify emergency borrowing during the pandemic. The problem? That clause was designed for temporary crises, not permanent debt structures. The Commission, under von der Leyen's leadership, transformed emergency powers into a de facto fiscal union without treaty amendments, without referendums, without democratic consent. The chamber erupted. Members of the European People's Party, von der Leyen's own political family, sat paralyzed. The Greens started shouting procedural objections, but Orbán wasn't finished. He pulled out a second document, this one marked with the seal of the German Bundesbank. It was a risk assessment report dated September 3, 2025, warning that if interest rates remain elevated, debt servicing costs could consume 23% of the EU's entire annual budget by 2030. That's money that won't go to infrastructure, climate initiatives, or defense. It'll vanish into bond markets, enriching creditors while European citizens watch their social services evaporate. Von der Leyen finally stood. The microphones picked up the scrape of her chair against the marble floor. She approached the podium with the controlled stride of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. But when she opened her mouth, what came out wasn't the confident, technocratic jargon Brussels specializes in. It was evasion dressed as complexity. She talked about intergenerational investment vehicles and fiscal sustainability frameworks without once addressing the core accusation. That the European Commission has mortgaged the future of 450 million people without their knowledge or consent. I watched the real-time market reaction on my laptop. The euro dropped 0.6% against the dollar within minutes. Italian bond yields spiked. The DAX in Frankfurt shuddered. Traders aren't stupid. They know what Orbán's revelation means. If the EU's debt structure is as fragile as he suggests, the next recession won't just hurt growth. It'll trigger a sovereign debt crisis that makes 2008 look like a rehearsal. And unlike individual nations, the EU has no central fiscal authority to backstop the collapse. There's no lender of last resort. There's just a committee of 27 countries, many of whom already despise each other, trying to agree on who pays the bill. The historical parallel is unavoidable. In 1931, the Creditanstalt Bank collapsed in Vienna, triggering a cascade of failures across Europe because financial systems were interconnected in ways policymakers didn't understand until it was too late. We're repeating that mistake on a continental scale. The EU's joint debt instruments have created hidden exposure chains. If one major economy defaults, not Italy, let's say France, the contagion doesn't stop at national borders. It rips through the entire union because we're all guarantors of each other's liabilities now. Orbán knows this. Von der Leyen knows this. The difference is, he's willing to say it out loud. The question period that followed was chaos. A French MEP demanded to know if Orbán's figures included the $750 billion next-generation EU recovery fund. Yes, he confirmed. A Spanish representative asked about collateral. Orbán's response was chilling. The collateral is the taxing power of member states. But what happens when those states refuse to tax their citizens to pay Brussels' debts? Silence. No one had an answer because there is no answer. The EU's fiscal architecture is built on the assumption that political unity will always override national self-interest. History suggests otherwise. I noticed something during the exchange that sent a chill down my spine. Von der Leyen's hands were shaking, not dramatically, just a slight tremor as she gripped the edge of the podium. This is a woman who has faced down Putin, negotiated vaccine contracts under impossible pressure, and survived multiple no-confidence motions. But this was different. This was existential. Because if Orbán's warnings prove accurate, her legacy won't be as the crisis manager who held Europe together. It'll be as the architect of its most catastrophic financial gamble. The media blackout began almost immediately. Major outlets buried the story below headlines about climate summits and celebrity scandals, but independent analysts were already running the numbers. A report from the Bruegel Institute, published just hours after Orbán's speech, confirmed his core thesis. The EU's debt-to-revenue ratio has reached unsustainable levels. Without structural reforms, meaning either massive tax increases or brutal austerity, the system collapses within a decade. And here's the political trap. Any government that proposes those reforms will be voted out of office. Democracy has become the enemy of solvency. The technical details Orbán revealed are even more damning when you examine them closely. He cited specific bond series, NGEU 2025A through NGEU 2025F, with maturity dates clustered between 2038 and 2054. The interest rate environment when these bonds were issued was historically low, around 0.4% to 1.2%, but current yields have pushed to 3.8%. That spread represents billions in additional debt servicing costs that weren't factored into original projections. The Commission's own forecasts acknowledge this risk but dismiss it as manageable under baseline scenarios. Orbán's accusation is simple. Those baseline scenarios are fiction. I spoke with a former ECB economist after the session. He confirmed what many in Brussels won't admit. The joint debt experiment was always a political project disguised as economic policy. The architects knew the math was precarious, but they gambled that future growth would outpace borrowing costs. That gamble is failing. European GDP growth has averaged 1.3% annually since 2020. While debt service obligations are growing at 4.7% per year. What makes this crisis uniquely dangerous is the lack of circuit breakers. When individual nations face debt crises, they can devalue currency or negotiate with the IMF. But the EU's joint liability structure has no equivalent safety mechanism. There's no provision for partial default, no restructuring framework. The treaties assume perpetual solvency backed by eternal political commitment. Orbán's warning is that this assumption is collapsing. Member states are already prioritizing national budgets over EU obligations. Poland reduced its contribution to the cohesion fund last quarter. Italy is demanding exemptions from fiscal rules. I watched von der Leyen's team scramble in the corridors after the session ended. Aides were on phones, coordinating damage control with national capitals, but Orbán's attack is fundamentally irrefutable. He presented audited financial data and asked a question the Commission cannot answer: how do we pay this back? Every evasion only reinforces his point. What terrifies me most isn't the debt itself, it's the lying. For 3 years, the Commission has published glossy reports celebrating the success of joint borrowing. They've held press conferences touting how EU bonds have lower interest rates than national debt. They've portrayed this as financial genius. But they've hidden the repayment timelines, the liability clauses, the clauses that allow the Commission to demand payment from member states without parliamentary approval. Orbán didn't reveal a scandal, he revealed a betrayal. The implications extend far beyond Brussels bureaucracy. Ordinary citizens across the continent are unknowing guarantors of this debt. A teacher in Portugal, a factory worker in Slovakia, a business owner in Ireland, they're all on the hook for bonds they never voted for, structured by technocrats they never elected. And when the bill comes due, it'll arrive as austerity mandates, pension cuts, healthcare reductions. As the session adjourned, I watched von der Leyen exit through a side door, surrounded by security and advisors. No press conference, no rebuttal statement, just silence. And in the world of high-stakes politics, silence is never a sign of strength. It's a confession. The markets will open tomorrow. The euro will fluctuate. Analysts will debate whether Orbán is a prophet or a saboteur. But the numbers don't care about narratives. 847 billion in debt is real. The lack of a repayment plan is real. And the political fractures running through this union are widening by the day. I glanced at my notes before filing this report. Transaction codes, bond maturity dates, the names of consultancy firms that collected millions in fees. The trail of evidence Orbán presented wasn't assembled overnight. This was years of investigation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. With European elected